I was taught law as if law applied to everybody anyhow, or even as a person who professed a particular faith. So I encountered a fourfold identity crisis. What is law? What is my role as a lawyer in society, and how do I navigate law space within the realities that I'm in? What is my role as a woman in and of the law? And answers were hard to come by. So I embarked on a journey of exploration of the space between my becoming a lawyer, my being a lawyer, and ultimately my becoming a woman of law, and locating myself in the variety of normative subjectivities, my being a woman and all the identities that come with being a woman, my being a member of an ethnic community, my being a member of, my professing a particular faith, my socioeconomic and political class, my clan, my family. And you know, family is broad here because there's the nuclear, the NATO, and my in-law family, my domicile of choice. And all these had implications for my identities. And I discovered that critique of law comes with the territory of studying law. It is quintessential to the study of law and requires rigor and reflection. So what's my argument? My argument is that formal law's claims of clarity, coherence, objectivity, certainty, stability are misleading. Because where law is defined to include other norms, custom, religion, and practices, its context and interpretation is flavored by those norms. Formal law does not control all people's lives and affairs in legal systems with diverse norms, especially in post-colonial societies. Formal law and other norms that operate with it may actually pull in different directions, and the overriding norms aren't always the formal ones. And in my observation, formal law, custom, religion, and practices as law, which are recognized in our Constitution, are strange bedfellows, because there is no calculus which determines what really prevails in the event of conflict. And we therefore have these multiple contestations and tensions between formal law and other norms. And these contestations are compounded by four interrelated issues. One, the non-formal norms may be, and actually often are, more compelling and accessible. People can be active also in spaces where formal law norms have not yet arrived, and the arrival of formal law is not always welcome, as we will see. Lawlessness or informalism can also become a standard operating procedure that challenges the operation of formal law norms. And here, the example of political coalitions and handshakes that we have in this country after divisive elections, which may actually displace constitutional norms and could even catalyze constitutional change, as we are now discussing in this country. We can also have rampant corruption, bad driving, matatuism, and border-borderism, which breed a culture of impunity where formal law is wantonly violated with no consequences. And so we have a new normal. We don't actually see bad driving as problematic. So we also have actions that abound that are neither legal nor illegal. They are outside the framework of law, and for instance, scientific experimentation and technological innovation, which are actually inquiry-driven with curiosity at the core. To earth my discussion, this is probably the toughest part of my discussion, I used some key concepts. I couldn't find any theories that really covered the work I was doing. And so what I did was to look at a number of concepts which I thought related to my work: the nature of law, the force of law, origins of law, legal pluralism and the related hierarchies of the normative orders, power, the public and the private, and coloniality. What is law? What is law is actually a very long jurisprudential debate that is yet to be resolved. So while we agreed that law is an indispensable tool, its meaning is elusive and indeterminate. And according to Cher, people steer their lives through an obstacle of rules. So even as we sit here, all of us, all dressed very nicely, you are all extremely smart. We are an amalgam of contending norms. So maybe your tribal law calls on you to be this way, the formal law calls on you to be this way, and then you also you subscribe to a faith which also has requirements on you. And these rules many times tell us, stop, move, don't do it this way. And you can see that choosing the right way can be very difficult when you have no entry. There's two ways to go. And they could be norms, rules. Some are called juridical norms, some are taboos. And the question is, are they all law? And my proposition is that I have not seen any touch and feel definition of law. Because when you ask people what law is, they'll begin to explain. Rather than tell you law is, they explain its origins, it's from God, from the people, from the sovereign, what are its functions, its consequences, or they'll give you examples. Some people will even tell you law is what courts say is law. But what about those norms, both formal and informal, that never darken the door of a court? Others link law to the consequences of breach. But you know that there may be people who are more afraid of the supernatural or losing face than going to jail or being fined. And actually, there is no telling what proverbial sword of Damocles threatens a person more, whether it's jail, fine, shame, curse. And the question one asks is, are lawyers the best place to tell which sword is the biggest threat? Then the nature of law. Formal law exists alongside other norms that regulate human conduct, and I think I've talked about this, religion, etiquette, but they are the semi-autonomous social fields defined by Sally Moore, the legal anthropologist, to be norm-generating and norm-enforcing realm. And the question is, where does formal law derive its validity and legitimacy from, and where do these other norms derive their validity from? And we have explanations by classical natural law adherents who say that law emanates from God, is consistent with God's law, and therefore there can be no unjust laws. But there are others like Cicero who will say law is right reason in agreement with nature. Then neo-naturalists see an inborn sense of justice in law and disagree with the classical naturalists on unjust laws not being laws, arguing that such laws, even though legal, are not obligatory. We go to others like Lon Fuller, who defend secular and procedural morality of law and distinguish the aspiration, which is the ideal, from the duty, the rules for orderly society, and then lists the requirements for the inner morality of law to include public promulgation, understability, not too often change, and then being consistently administered. Contestations begin right there. How do we justify law as a tool of social ordering in post-colonial societies where formal law was introduced in a brutish, rogue, and disorderly manner and actually was not uniformly enforced? And what is the nature of law in heterogeneous and legally pluralistic societies that have social norms that regulate human conduct besides formal law? Which norms are actually outside Judeo-Christian norms, which are the basis of most introduced formal law norms? We have other religions, such as Islam, African religions, we have local ethics, we have culture, social conventions, and morality. The third contestation is the concept of the overall deity. And whereas in our constitution, in the preamble, we talk about one country under God, that takes into account monotheistic religions. But then there may be people who subscribe to other than the monotheistic religion. And then the other question is, do customary law norms meet Fuller's criteria, given that they are flexible, dynamic, they are not written, and they are not publicly promulgated? Another concept I look at is the rule of law, which is a political ideal highly revered. Everybody talks about the breakdown of the rule of law in Kenya, but the scope and meaning of this ideal is contested. When people talk about the rule of law, and I think Aristotle was the first one to talk about the rule of law, it's distinguished from the rule of men, and is used for organizing modern societies and laws, promoting liberties, order, predictability, restraining actor structures and institutions and individuals. So it is there where we find tenets like equality before the law, no arbitrary exercise of power, remedies for breach of law or unlawful interference with liberties. Positivists insist on strict procedural aspects of the rule of law, clarity, stability, generality. But moral philosophy adds substantive aspects to rule of law, which are justice, fairness, and morality. And the question is, do the religious customary law tenets recognized in our Constitution and norms emanating from the semi-autonomous social fields meet the rule of law criteria? They are actually part of law, broadly speaking. They can be very strong, determine rights and duties, and actually determine one's belonging. They are also the basis for our local citizenship. They can be more widely followed and enforced. For instance, even though no law in this country has ever prohibited women from owning land, we know that in many of our communities, women don't have rights to land, and that is attributed to custom. What is the standing of these norms versus formal law and rule of law, where people follow them more than they do formal law? So rule of law can be threatened by wanton breaches of formal law that renders it powerless, like the impunity we talked about, the informalism, the development of new norms, or the wanton disregard for law and court orders, which makes the observance of law the exception rather than the rule. Where you have activities where law is yet to reach, these can also challenge the rule of law. Like, for instance, and we'll see this later, in genetic modification, information communication technologies, where you have mobile money and drones. Where does law get its force from? And for formal law, it is distinct from many other norms, distinct from religion and ethics, principally because it has force and it can coerce, and is enforced by a state that has what Shea calls the monopoly of violence. In Austinian words, it is backed by sanctions. And Hart justifies coercion of law on account of the fact that human beings do not have much benevolence and altruism. Many of us, when we are left to our devices, we will push our self-interest and take advantages of social cooperation. So what law does is to adjust the moral calculus of human beings by affording us moral reasons for taking action. So law tells us what to do, and that if we do not obey, there are bad things that will happen to us. But moral behavior can also be a function of internalization of social norms and social expectations. And that is where naming, shaming, ostracization, and loss of face comes in. Here, it is the distinction between juridical and moral norms. When we try to distinguish these two, it is blurry in plural legal systems. The term juridical norms is used to mean formal norms, traceable to the Hobbesian or Lockean pre-state era or state of nature, and described in the social contract theory, where people gathered together of necessity to form a social contract, surrendered their personal power to enjoy the benefits of collective order such as security. And scholars, of course, argue that the surrender of this power by citizens is the basis of the state monopoly of violence. The norms agreed upon constituted the first juridical norms and evolved over time from a central authority to organize states with the executive, legislature, and judiciary, and actually with a whole branch, the legislature, with authority to make laws. I'd like to point out that our constitution reframed our social contract. And so we can't say that juridical norms are only formal norms because it recognizes norms other than formal law norms. Then there is legal pluralism, which basically, this is critical to my work because we are talking about contending norms in a plural legal system. And legal pluralism is the existence of more than one legal order in a social field and results from global human mobility, colonialism, diversity of cultures or ethnicities. Law in a plural legal state, according to Tamanaha, is whatever is recognized by agents as law in their social practices. And it gives rise to supremacy contests between different norms. So when you have a plural legal system, there'll be official law and unofficial law, whether recognized in formal law or not. And as long as the norms in this unofficial law modify, transform, affect, or alter patterns of behavior, they are law. We have a list of official law here where we have state law, then we have customary law, religious law. These don't operate in silos. They do interact and intersect. And then the norms from the semi-autonomous social fields. And you know, when we talk about norms from semi-autonomous social fields, people wonder, what would those be? In different families, there is somebody who sits on a particular chair. It's not a law, but nobody else will sit on it. Who is entitled to the remote control? You know, that can be a big cause of a quarrel in a family. And let us get to matters food. Who eats what part of what animal or chicken? That, you know, they are norm generating and norm enforcing. But you know, it's not law, but you know that if you go and pick the part that you're not supposed to pick, choices have consequences. And then, of course, there is living law, which is law that dominates life itself. And this is law that is coined as situations are encountered. And it could be evolutions of customary law, where customary law, say, hasn't been given women rights to land. Then there are many women who now are having children out of wedlock, and you cannot throw them away. So customary law evolves to accommodate them, or the creative tensions that we have between the normative orders. Because of our opportunism and self-interest, we could actually flavor the norms to suit ourselves rather than to have them for the common good. And then, for some of us, it encourages forum shopping. You know, there are people who root themselves in custom when it suits them. And then they move to modernity when it suits them. That I have only one wife, and when it suits them, and an African man must have more than one badge of honor. This is an example in Sierra Leone of legal pluralism. And you can see formal law is at the very top, but you have chiefs, you have customary lineage, but you also have other pockets. Because of the fact that Sierra Leone had conflict, you have combatants, you have refugees, you have disenfranchised youth. And you know, all these can be actually semi-autonomous social fields that generate norms and enforce norms. And people may begin to choose where they want to go for justice. And so somebody might ask, when you want justice, how much justice can you afford? Because you know there is different forms of justice on offer. Not all norms are equal, and the hierarchy is set out in the Judicature Act, and actually in our constitution now. All laws must conform to the constitution, which is the Grund norm, undergirds the legal system. I'm using the Grund norm for the law students, just in case they think that I have not studied law. So if they live with nothing else, the Grund norm under Hans Kelsen. And all tenets must conform to, all laws must conform to the constitutional tenets. But you know, the laws could also operate side by side, and actually without clashing and reinforce and legitimize each other. For instance, before 2010, the 2010 Constitution, our law allowed for gendered treatment of subjects of law in personal law matters, burial, devolution of property upon death, inheritance. And that was mandated by the Constitution. So because the Constitution didn't include sex as a prohibited ground of discrimination, discrimination could happen sanctioned by formal law. Colonizers judged customary law norms a priori in formal law repugnancy clauses. And it was provided that customary law only applied if it wasn't repugnant to justice and morality. The assumption being that only customary law norms can offend the repugnancy clause. And we might ask, are there perchance modern law norms, formal law norms that offend our sense of morality and justice? And whose morality and justice? Customary law growth was therefore stunted by subjugation to the introduced norms. And the paradox is that we had eminence of and preference for introduced formal norms, even as customary and other informal norms were more ubiquitous and prevalent, with a blanket condemnation of customary and other informal norms. And of course, irrespective of where they are in the hierarchy, all these norms apply and interact directly or indirectly. I keep saying that as we sit here, we are an amalgamation of norms. No, we can't all say that only one set of norms applies to us. And that's why Share says we steer our lives through a course of rules. And you see, even when they're applied by courts, they do interact. And also where customary law may influence the content of formal official law. And this interaction can lead to clashes because of the different content, values, and motivations. Power is an important concept because, as defined by Don Oliver, power is the possibility of imposing one's will upon the behavior of other persons. It's exercised in public and private. You have public power in the realm of the state or outside of what would be private, which is mainly for the things I have studied in the family. All interactions, whether they are among individuals, between individuals, and even between the individuals and the states, they are nuanced by power relations. And power relationships mediate rights. Different relationships have power asymmetries, and the powerful are likely to abuse power. And the failure to take into account these power imbalances can lead to injustice and reinforce and confirm inequalities. In fact, the liberal theory from which public-private dichotomy draws ignores the imbalance in power relations, particularly in the private sphere, in the household or the family, where it's out of the state reach, and you can have a lot of generational where children are treated shabbily or women are treated shabbily, and they are not able to exercise power because they are supposed to be seen and not heard. The last concept is coloniality, and I think this requires not much explanation. Many of our laws came because of colonialism, and our lives were fundamentally altered by colonization, because the colonialists sought to forcefully overlay, mute, superimpose colonial law over customary law, religion, and practices with limited success, especially in private law matters, but try they did. And so tensions between customary law and formal law abound to date. Colonialists considered customary law backward and uncivilized. They also found it difficult to control locals without a uniform colonial law, and therefore imposing this colonial law was an imperial scheme to elevate formal law and have one way of controlling the native. And with coloniality, we have a binary of legality, illegality, formality, informality. And in fact, that we still have customary law is testament to the sheer resilience and force of this law. And if we are to develop an African customary law epistemology, we can only do that by decolonizing law to ensure that there is no blanket condemnation of its tenets. So all that I have been trying to say is covered in this diagram. You can see colonialism is a big factor. And within colonialism, you have formal law and you have religion. There is a particular religion that came with formal law. But there is also other religions. And you can see colonialism did encroach on semi-autonomous social fields, on custom, and on religion. But it did not subjugate all of them. But the important point is that power doesn't move in a unilinear direction. You have power from formal law to custom, and from custom to formal law, and so forth. So now I go to areas of law that I have looked at where I'm trying to support my thesis on these contending norms. And land is the first one. And colonialism here is where we start with the acquisition and subjugation of local norms on land. With, for those of, I'm sure many of us actually have read the late Professor Okoth Ogendo's Tenants of the Crown, when Chief Justice Bath in 1915 deciding on the effect of the 1915 Crown Lands Ordinance, said that the Africans were mere tenants at will with no more than temporary occupancy rights. So just with a stroke of the pen, African rights were obliterated and overlain. So you have the dual rights, modern formal ownership, titling, individual ownership, customary and native rights, and unregistered and informal rights, and the hoisting of legality over legitimacy by assuming that formal law had greater force in people's lives than customary law, and masking historical injustices by colonialists, the gross disparities in land holdings, iniquities, and the granting to title for unjustly acquired land rights, which sealed the fate of land and permanently removed it from native ownership and use. The expectation of the colonialists was that native rights would either die or grow up and become formal. This has not been realized to date. And the many commissions on land are testament to this continuing problem. The Lancaster Constitution favored settlers' rights to land, discounting African claims. And stories are told of the moral dilemma of Thurgood Marshall, the American civil rights lawyer who came to help the African nationalists negotiate the Lancaster Constitution, and how he supported the rights of the settlers and persuaded the nationalists to be happy that they were getting civil and political rights. And we have seen that repeated in South Africa. So the post-independence handling of land rights continued the colonial biases, disenfranchising hordes of natives, but actually in discussions creating what they call a landed African gentry that would be the buffer between the settlers who maintained land and the African nationalists still hankering, the mavericks hankering for land rights. Somebody has said, I think it's either Rodney or somebody who's referred to it in those words. So informal customary land law norms remained resilient despite the centuries of suppression, as Okoth Ogendo would argue, and these remain a threat to formal norms. Because land rights enhance relationships through value and recognition, and that's why they say that good fences make good neighbors, landowners protected by formal law have neighbors operating under informal norms. And if you have additional subscribers to land rights, it increases the value of your property. And this is because your rights to anything are as good as the respect that your neighbors have for those rights. That's why you need as many subscribers as possible, who will keep away who economists call free riders. Do you recognize this? If you think that I am exaggerating, you know, Governor Sang is a lawyer, and he has taken the law literally into his hands. And why he's taking the law into his hands is because of this contest that we have between land rights that have been granted and the contests that are still there over land rights. So the state provides a mechanism for enforcing property law for formal property, and this ensures standardization. And because formal law emphasizes individual rights and economic value of land, it is at variance with those who access and use land customarily with no formal legal title, and where a lot of the suasion is really social and moral, because their rights are recognized by the community. In fact, you know, there's still people who sell land communally, and the rights are respected. So if people think that it's only the title deed, there are people who just measure a number of steps, and you can use the land, and there will be no need for anything written. There is a way of enforcing those rights. But you see, where you have private property that has to be protected with guns, this is telling you, if you can read this, you are within range. So you should move a little bit away. So you have here contending norms. And the question is, in all of Kenya, is land a commodity for everybody? You know, there are some of us for whom land is not a commodity. And there is also the question of, is land alienable or is it inalienable? You know, some of us see our beings embedded in the land. And this is why you will buy land from somebody in your village, and they will keep coming for fees for their children, because the money got finished, but the land is still there. So these contentions imperil the interactions between formally and informally held land. And these we see a lot in the pastoral lands, like in Kajiado, in Nandi, we saw the governor there, and also in Laikipia. And remember that Kashmir land ownership was only formally recognized in 2010, even though there was recognition of trust land and group land, the group ranches, it was not in the same way as community land rights. And you can see here the land invasions. What makes this happen is because of the lack of a complete network of subscribers for the property norms. So your neighbors don't respect your land rights. And in fact, until 2010, the network was incomplete because it excluded a big part of Kenya. Public and private land in Kenya is only about 40%. The rest is community land. So if your network is only 40%, then your rights are not as well protected. And then our policy, historically, because of our colonial history, has favored agriculture and neglected pastoralism and wildlife conservation on this land. So formal land rights, and I know this is not a good message for many here who think title is everything. Formal land rights are minority, they are tenuous, and do not guarantee peaceful or secure land holding. And you remember, during the post-election violence in 2007, 2008, if you don't believe me, title holders in the IDP camps while other people were on their land. And the state was unable to restore the title holders despite the use of the army. And settlement schemes introduced to deal with landlessness add tensions to the informal land claims, because I don't know how better to put it than to say that when we got independence, because of what I said, the protection of the rights of the settlers, poor peasants were exported to Rift Valley and to the coast. And you know now people who live in Rift Valley and Coast are wondering why I'm saying they were exported. But you see, everybody had ancestral land, but there were people that were exported. But where they were settled and given formal land rights and titles, they were not accepted by those among whom they were settled. And you know this term that is usually used during elections, madoa-doa, who are people who don't belong, who have claims based on formal norms versus claims of insiders, which are based actually on informal and customary norms. The other area I've looked at is gender. And here I'm more talking about gender as the social construction of maleness and femaleness with power and lack of power. Gender is the subject of plural norms, and I think the 2010 Constitution has changed a lot for gender. But family relations are still difficult to subject to anti-discrimination requirements because customary norms apply despite formal norms outlawing discrimination. And the customary law actors and structures mediate women's access to resources and justice. And what law many times tries to do is to add and star women into men's laws. You know, men's laws, women's lives. And the consistency of the adding and starring is not as good, because even as we say that he includes she, laws fostering is male. So formal law can be rendered, on equality can be rendered powerless by informal norms on gender. What people say that de jure equality, de facto discrimination. And this Norwegian scholar captures it very well when he says, as long as we live in a society where men and women follow different paths, we'll have the gender-neutral legal machinery meeting the gender-specific reality. And this brings us to the importance of social science research methods to unearth critical experiences of women. We can't just look at law. And in the 90s, I saw Janet here and others who are with me. We wanted to find out why were women not inheriting property. So we decided to go to court. There were very few cases. And so we wondered, oh, then Kenyan women must be doing very well. But we realized that people were being widowed, but probably the matters weren't going to court. And so we did research where we looked for widowers and widows. There were very few widowers, but widows were many. And those who are lawyers know why there are many widows, because the widow's rights expire if they remarry, but the widower's rights don't expire. So the widower can remarry and maintain the rights, but the widow, if they want to keep the rights, they must remain unmarried. And we found that actually for many women, what they went through was very different. We looked at Murang'a, Kajiado, we went to Nyakach, and we went to Mombasa. Looking at the lived realities of women's lives actually helps you to come up with more holistic picture. And for me, it's been paradoxical that growing up in a village, I never encountered gender discrimination. Actually, my first encounter with gender discrimination is in this university as an employee. And it is looking at the employment rights of married women. Because you see, we got one contract with my male colleagues, but mine had many things read into it, like you didn't get a house, you couldn't, if you took maternity leave, you couldn't take annual leave. And you know, people think this is an exaggeration. I do have this file because I did receive these letters. And for us, this was actually at that point addressed. This is before the Employment Act 2007, which gives women 3 months. You had 60 days, which is short. And so when President Moi visited the university and went to the senior common room, he took Professor Maria Nzomo approaching the subject, and Moi could decree law, and he said people should get the same rights. So the robust equality and non-discrimination provisions in our Constitution have encountered the gendered reality. And this you see in politics and decision-making, you see it in land ownership. In terms of politics and decision-making, despite the two-third gender rule, many decisions by courts about this, we are not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel. At the end of the tunnel, other than an oncoming truck in the form of punguza mzigo. And the women's rights are, again, to land, especially matrimonial property. Again, you have very clear provisions. Then you have a Matrimonial Property Act, which goes back to what we had tried to do away with, which is contribution. And when you begin to say contribution, people say, can we quantify the work women do? And the only way of comparing is the house girl, So you devalue women's work. And even the challenge of the Matrimonial Property Act as being unconstitutional failed. The third area, and please stay with me, is environment. And I'll tell you, the reason that I'm looking at all this is because if I don't look at them, then my thesis is not complete. So in environment, we have the coloniality is the real the informing norm here, which separated Africans from their resources through protected areas, granting the settlers unlimited rights to extract resources and also to game hunting, using African lands as playing fields. And conservation, whereas Africans had lived with their natural resources, conservation was a process removed from the people. And its values were removed from the needs of the natives. So you have parks being protected as a special kind of Eden for the European psyche, rather than as a complex changing environment and severing connections between people and the environment. And this explains why we have militarization of forest and wildlife institutions, because you have more people wanting to break the law. Because for most native Africans, living a normal life without breaking the law became impossible with natural resource laws. Brutal treatment of Africans for infractions, and the destruction of community natural resource institutions, with the state emerging as the sole guardian of resources. Yet, the state does not live with the resources. So you have incongruence of formal conservation norms with people's lived realities, and therefore conflicts which make it difficult to enlist communities to support natural resource management. And in Californian speak, people then shoot the animals, they shovel it up, and they shut up because nobody will know. There are more people breaking the law unless you have a police person for every person who is trying to use natural resources. So the global move towards sustainable development refocused natural resource management, and it's good to see that now we have enlistment of all, and our constitution has actually taken the cue, departing from the colonial foundations. You look at the preamble, Article 11 on indigenous technologies, and the requirement to make law to make sure communities receive compensation and royalties for their cultures. Having lamented in a lot of my work, I lamented, especially in my doctoral thesis and book on land and wildlife, I lamented the exclusion of communities. So I'm now delighted to see formal law making room for informal customary law norms, and these you find in the 2016 Community Land Act and in the 2013 Wildlife Conservation and Management Act. And of course, it need not be said that the quest for natural resource management in Kenya calls for the enlistment of everybody. Gender, land, and environment is a place where you have different norms coming together, which govern land, environment, and gender, but because they are not synchronized, they do not promote sustainable environmental management and gender equality. Land, which is a major factor of production, but also a locus of natural resources, is colonized by patriarchal norms. I wrote once a paper that the land has its owners and they are not women. And I still stand by that because even when women own land, there will be wannabe patriarchs who want to hoist their rights over those of their mothers, of their sisters. Have you seen stories of petty patriarchs chasing away their mothers from land? So we have formal gender neutral and customary gendered law, which relates to natural resources and land. And here we have intersectional exclusion in formal and informal law. And we have I think it's both Spivak and Gramsci, who talk about women as subalterns, who are the lowest of the law. So norms that explicitly or implicitly condone gender inequality and discrimination compound women's quest for equality, even if you want to vie for elections. And in this country, where people need a lot of money, if you don't own land, what are you going to mobilize in our current scenario of going to get votes where you have to pay people to vote for you? The exclusion of women's experiences in natural resource management discounts their crucial management role and separates the resources from critical managers. The last area that I've looked at is law, science, and technology, which challenges formal law norms. And it's important for me to see that law, science, and technology challenges formal law norms, because here you have nimble industry practices or lab protocols which allow activities in unnavigated terrain. So these activities are carried out under no specific law, but they offend no law. And I think in this country we have the example of mobile money. For those of you who remember what happened with drones, the unmanned aerial vehicles, people were using them to take pictures until they were one day used at a public event at Nyayo Stadium, and they scared the president. And so they were stopped, and the KAA was asked to come up with rules. And also access to licensed spectrum. You know, access to spectrum is a finite resource. And each country gets an allocation of spectrum. But because it is limited, it is important to maximize its use. And you can actually access people's radio and TV frequencies when they are not in use without their permission, using sophisticated technology. You know, there's a time I was tempted to buy a scrambler. You know, when you go to a meeting and everybody's phone is ringing, you know, you buy a scrambler, so no phone calls will come in. And people just think, oh, there was no network. So you have spectrum used in what are called TV white spaces. So it's almost like an invisible hidden hand looking for what's not in use. And then you take it and use it, what they call cognitive radio. And these rely more on technological devices than on licensing and monitoring. And as demand for spectrum increases and pooling and sharing become the norm, there'll be less reliance on formal law norms to guide use. We will use more technology, because as people say, the solution to technological problems is in technology. And you know, I hate to imagine what will happen to us as lawyers. Then there's GMO research also started in a regulatory vacuum. And you have these scientists who are mapping, when they were mapping the human genome, and this may have been what our GM scientists were thinking, they were anxious at the prospect of legal intrusion. And in fact, you know, James Watson, recording this, says that they didn't want draconian legislation, experimental do's and don'ts in some legalese, bad for science, politically minded review panels, hopeless bureaucracy that comes with this kind of territory and takes hold like moths in the grandmother's closet. So in this country, GMO research happened under draft regulations. And we were not able to come up with a GMO Act until 2009. And even as we speak, we do have a Biosafety Act, but our policy is ambivalent. You will see every day in the newspapers, people are saying whether we should lift the ban or keep the ban, because a ban was put in place in 2012 by the Minister for Public Health. It's still in place, but work on GMO is still continuing. There are confined field trials, there are laboratory experiments, and I think what we haven't had is commercialization. The ban was to be lifted after the report of a task force that was supposed to certify that genetically modified food has no adverse health effects. But this is yet to be made public. So the ban remains, but the contestations over formal legal norms have not hindered the work. And we have had small-scale farmers going to court asking for conservatory orders against lifting of the ban, but this failed. And the point I'm making is that even in science and technology that is quite formal legal norms may take time to get ensconced in experimental scientific activities. And I'd like to raise our attention to robotics. Did you see the woman who was making a presentation in Kigali? The robot woman. What law applies to that robot woman? If she fell on somebody, I mean, what is her agency? And in essence, we as lawyers need to begin thinking about what will technology do to us. Maybe we should actually do something before what happened to ordinary taxis when Uber came happens to ourselves, because technology is actually really moving fast. You have operations in hospital being done using robots. What is the role of law in this if the matter should come before court? And you know, many of these activities will happen until the issue of property rights arises, or contracts, or there is liability for torts. And another way in which the problem has arisen is where you have patented GM seed planted on land that is the subject of land rights. And we all know that whatever is on the land belongs to the land. But in this case, Monsanto sued a Canadian farmer on whose land was found patented seed. And the patented seed was owned by Monsanto, and the farmer owned the land. And what the farmer was saying is that the seed got there by cross-pollination. And the court actually decided, whilst the farmer owned the land, the rights to the patented seed remained the rights of Monsanto. And this is likely to be a very complex scenario where you have customary land rights. And in our country, where farms are small, so the possibility of seeds coming to your land from your neighbors is much higher. And then, of course, the final one is the traditional knowledge norms and genetically modified food and drugs intellectual property rights. We have community-level norms where food and medicine raw material is sourced, which differ markedly from national and international norms where drugs and marketed foods are sold. And we have an overvaluation of intellectual property rights based on knowledge and devaluation of traditional knowledge that is the foundation of the activities. So at the end of all this, I'm looking at two terms, legality and legitimacy. And the two terms actually, when you look at legality, we say it's in accordance with the law, sanctioned by the Constitution and laws, but you can see one of its synonyms is legitimacy. Whereas legitimacy means conforming to the law or rules and able to be defended with logic. And one of its synonyms is actually legal. So we have legality, that is conformance to law, and legitimacy, which is ability to be defended with logic, converging, but they differ because actions can be legitimate but illegal, or illegitimate but legal. And here I give the example of discrimination against women, which is legitimate in many cultures but illegal under formal law. And conversely, rights of women are illegitimate in many cultures but clothed with legal gap in law. And then community rights are illegal because property rights are couched as individual in formal law, but the ubiquity of communal claims to property renders individual rights illegitimate in some cases, forcing change in formal law to endow community rights with legality. The usual way of doing things and deference to informal rules may also yield flagrant disregard of substantive formal law norms despite the legal backing with punitive sanctions. And one here is the war against corruption without referring to any case. And here again, many times people find legal technicalities being barriers to the discussion of substantive issues. So you have rule mongering versus canvassing of pertinent issues. And for many citizens, they see our courts as theaters where the justice in the public perception is sacrificed at the altar of legal formalism, which may lead to the reluctance to take matters to court, as the public has jaundiced view of courts' handling of the matters, which can breed contempt for formal law. It could also lead to emergence of extra-legal ways of handling issue, which may be illegal or illegal. So the result here is formal law's impotence in handling issues that people consider important. As courts are very busy with textual rule application legality, citizens must own up that this is the school to which I belong. Legal purists or positivists believe law is an anachronistic artifact, self-sufficient and knowable by itself without recourse to societal realities. And the case law is relevant here. This case of Martin Charo against the Republic, I think, won the worst case in gender equality worldwide, where the High Court set aside a defilement conviction and held that a child below 18 years who carried herself as an adult, misrepresented herself to a male adult, and consented to sexual intercourse could not later claim that she had been defiled. The judge did not give effect to the legal principle that a child, though willing, cannot consent to sexual intercourse, since she has no capacity. His decision was legitimate and expected, not only to the accused person, but also to his community, which considered the act as a non-criminal consensual act. Actually, it could be a romance that could have led to marriage. So this calls for us moving from what is legitimate and legal to integrity or wholeness, so that when we have norms that satisfy legality and legitimacy tests, we should test those against integrity, that is the promotion of wholeness through the well-being of all the members of society. And in the Charo case, the integrity principle is that an adult having sex with a child is wrong and should not be condoned under any circumstances. Our Constitution has many calls for integrity in the preamble, in the national values and principles of governance, in Chapter 6 on leadership and integrity. But despite the Constitution, threats to integrity and wholeness abound, because we have these other opposing norms which have greater legitimacy. We have a Constitution that we honor more in violating than in following. What I think Okoth Ogendo, Shivji, and Yashpal Gai have called constitutions without constitutionalism. But there is also unbridled greed and impunity that came with capitalism, which in my view are repugnant to justice and morality. And this calls for us to move beyond law, to consider the general good and treating others right, whether law requires us to do it or not, and whether it is legitimate or not. So in conclusion, formal law pegged on legality has its limits. Admission of informal norms predicated on legitimacy is not enough to remedy the grave shortfalls of formal law, because when you have plurality of norms, you have diversity of motivations, values, and interests. So we need to transcend the legal and legitimacy domains and get to a sphere of positive humanness, Ubuntu or good manners. Because, you know, good manners cannot be legislated. We need to observe or practice essential human virtues of compassion, humanity, empathy, drawing on elements of Utu, Umuntu, Ubuntu, or might I say, Omodo, in African cultures and different religions and traditions in search for integrity and wholeness. No man or woman is an island. I am because you are. So we need to watch out for each other. And with regard to care for our environment, I really like Pope Francis's encyclical letter, Laudato Si, when he talks about care for our common home, promoting stewardship against unbridled consumerism that destroys the environment. Even if you can afford it, that is wrong. We need to isolate wholeness, integrity, equality, equity, fairness, non-discrimination elements in all the areas of law, customary, religious, semi-autonomous social fields. And when we use technology, we should ensure that we use it for good, not for evil. Again, in the interest of Utu. And also promote congruence between the integrity values in our Constitution and our actions through virtuous living and human goodness. Following the cardinal virtues of justice, prudence, temperance, fortitude, courage, and magnanimity. I thank you.